All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. This is a special summer series that we're doing specifically for Preservation Leadership Forum members. So we really appreciate your support and developed these webinars to give you access to expertise that we have here at the National Trust. The series is everything you wanted to know about safe in places, but we're afraid to ask. Today is the second in our series of 4 webinars, and we'll be focusing on grants and development. So if you're familiar with our forum webinar series, this one's a little bit different. It's much more informal. There is no presentations. We'll be answering questions from you, our forum members. So the way the structure will work is we'll start with the questions that were submitted ahead of time when you registered for the session. And then we'll go ahead and answer questions that you have live today. And we ask that you submit questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, but feel free to use the chat function for anything else, like introducing yourself and where you're from, and what part of preservation you work in would be a great way to start. But feel free also, as we're answering questions, to contribute to the conversation in the chat. A few logistics before we start. We are recording the session, and we will send this to the email that you use to register for the session. All of our forum webinars are available on our National Trust YouTube channel. And we have enabled captioning for those of you who would like to use captioning. So we have 2 experts on staff at National Trust that are going to be speaking to you today about grants and development. And first is Nicole Vann, who is the Director of Grants and Awards. And Nikki, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience and what you do here at the National Trust?
Sure. Thanks, Rhonda. Hi, my name is Nicole Vann. I'm the Director of Grants and Awards here at the Trust. I have been with the National Trust since 2004, working with our grant program in some form that entire time. Also working with the forum program at one point in my past, so I'm familiar with you all and your interests in general. But the National Trust last year awarded over $12 million to over 300 preservation projects throughout the country. And all of that grant making, me and my team, we touch in some way. And so I am here today to answer questions specifically about our program. And Michelle is a more general fundraising expert who can help you out with those questions.
All right. And then, as Nikki mentioned, our other panelist is Michelle Horton, who is the Vice President of Institutional Giving here at the National Trust. So Michelle, tell us a little bit about your experience and your role here at the Trust.
Thanks, Rhonda. Thanks, Nikki. And it's great to see the chat like blowing up with the enthusiasm and folks introducing themselves. I am new at the Trust. I joined the Trust in February of 2023. Previous to the Trust, I spent about 9 years, 10 years really, in the museum universe fundraising for arts, culture, and sciences. And what really drew me to the Trust is the national impact and the ability to really leverage our historic sites, themes, and preservation themes about identity that are so important to all of us, and the opportunity to raise really significant money for an organization with major impact. Before specializing in institutional giving, I spent, and even in my previous museum work, I spent a lot of time overseeing board development, leadership in major gifts, individual giving, annual fund support, and events. So I've really worked the gamut in development, and I'm happy to answer questions as they relate to institutional giving, grants, and more.
Thanks, Michelle. And I should introduce myself. I'm Rhonda Sincavage. I'll be moderating the discussion today and work in the Preservation Services and Outreach Department at the National Trust, and also have been very involved with Preservation Leadership Forum over the years. So we're going to go ahead and go right into our question and answer period. And as I mentioned, we're going to tackle the questions that were submitted ahead of time first, and then we will address questions that you have live. Please submit questions through the Q&A, and then, make any other sort of comments you would like in the chat. Also, we are going to start with some general questions, and then we'll go into more specific questions that we received about the National Trust Program. So I'm going to start with a very general question about how can I raise money in the midst of a difficult economy? And I think this is something that everyone probably is going to have on their mind recently. So do either of you want to start that first? And feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in. I have found that difficult economies oftentimes impact individual giving first. I was just thinking about what I really wanted to focus on today, and what I wanted to focus on was really, building a robust fundraising program that includes grants and individual giving. But in a tough economy, while we want to be growing our individual giving programs, it is the foundations and oftentimes actually government agencies up to a certain point, depending on how long the recession is going, that will still be able to maintain funding, sometimes at higher levels and sometimes at levels that increase over years when the economy is flush and when grantees are not struggling. So there have been several instances in my work, especially in 2008, 2007, 2008, certainly during COVID, when funding from institutional partners increased while funding from individual donors decreased, because individual donors were reacting much more quickly to a worsening economic climate. So maintaining a grants program is still possible. In fact, we need to keep moving during these recessions and maintain robust fundraising practices and increase our fundraising practices in order to keep pace with a worsening economy. Certainly, human services, education are going to be the funding areas and the areas of support that are more robust, that weather those storms a little bit easily. But how you position the case for support for your projects and for your initiatives as really critical to human welfare, quality of life, et cetera. There might be several impacts related to your communities that can be articulated. So thinking about the impact of your work and positioning that work as critically important during those times is going to be an essential way of fundraising in a decreased economic moment.
Great, thanks. Our next question is asking about how to find information about grants available for historic preservation. And I think, this of course includes grants that the National Trust has to offer, but do you have any advice about other sources of grants for historic preservation funding?
Sure. So, broadly, we get that question a lot in our office. We typically recommend that folks reach out to their statewide preservation organizations, local organizations, because sometimes they will have their own grant programs that are perhaps less competitive because they're either locally or state-based. We refer people to the National Park Service. They have annual, fairly robust grant programs, and I'm sure that most of you on this call are familiar with that. SHPO offices can sometimes be a good source as well. There are some directories out there. I know of one that at least you have to pay a membership fee to access that do collect funding sources for preservation. The National Trust doesn't provide its own database of that, but it's out there. But Michelle, since you actively have to reach out to these organizations, where do you turn to find available opportunities?
I spend a lot of time researching private philanthropy, not just for preservation, but for foundations, corporations, and of course, government entities that support programming, community outreach, education programs, capital and infrastructure needs, collections management, collections research. So really moving from, so that being said, preservation is one nut, and there is a lot of government support, like Nikki pointed out, but I'm also looking at all of the needs within our historic sites that really wrap around the preservation work, and finding funders that have an interest and a mission alignment with the work that's happening across the sites. So for example, if we're looking at extraordinary landscape needs and we need to revamp a site's landscape and make it more climate resilient, I'm going to look for funders that might be interested in preservation, but I'm also going to look for funders that are interested in climate resiliency, cultural landscapes, and that kind of work. Beyond the local and state government agencies that might support that kind of project. Education programs, like I mentioned, it depends, of course, on the historic site and what the education programs seek to accomplish and what ages of students they reach. Something, like an education program reaching college students versus K through 12 is going to look very, very different. But we find funders that might be interested in education that is adjacent to preservation to help offset those preservation needs. Looking for support for operating expenses is often difficult, but there are organizations that might be mission aligned with your goals and impact at a specific site that can then provide some of that operating budget relief as well.
It's interesting, Michelle, that you talked about looking at the programmatic focus of different funders, because what we're seeing more of are organizations whose primary mission is not preservation, but they're in a historic site. And so they're coming to us for those preservation needs, but the services they're providing are not traditional historic preservation based activities. Yep. So we're seeing more of that as well. I
would also, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because there are fewer private funders on the foundation and certainly on the corporate side that support preservation work, particularly related to capital needs, right? So those capital projects are a little bit more difficult to fund. This is why I also foreground investing in our individual giving programs, because it's through the individual giving that we are able to meet match requirements and continue to grow our fundraising sustainably. But the preservation only funders are rather limited. They're rather limited. The Foundation Center online is a great resource. If you all don't have subscriptions to it to do foundation research, that is a great resource to help identify funders.
Great. Thanks to both of you for those answers. Our next question is asking about what are the components of a successful grant proposal? And I think, this will be interesting. The two of you have different perspectives where, Nikki, you're usually reviewing grants that are submitted to the National Trust, and Michelle is usually seeking funding. So yeah, I don't know which of you wants to begin, but please share. What do you think are the successful components of a grant?
I can tell you what we see trip people up a lot, or raise questions in our reviewers' minds. We do ask for a budget, and the budgets that people submit aren't always aligned with what they are describing in their narrative. And so like a clear tie between your budget and the scope of work you're proposing is key. And if a reviewer has to try to decipher your budget, it's gonna turn them off. And that sometimes can be disqualifying. We also find, especially in the preservation, in this kind of funding, we find people who either focus almost exclusively on the site and its history and its historical importance, but don't at all talk about how it's relevant today and how it's being used today and what the community impact is today. And that's something that our reviewers look for. And so if you're purely telling us the history of your site and not at all talking about how the public might be engaging with it today, that's also going to be a detriment to a proposal on our end. The other things that I think researching any organization you're applying to, knowing what their current programmatic priorities are, what their focus is, and weaving that into your proposal being sure that you're articulating, it not only demonstrates that you're aligned with the work that we're doing, but it shows that you've taken the time to actually look at our website, learn who we are, know what we care about. So it shows that, you know, you're willing to be a partner in this process and in these projects.
I agree with everything that Nikki just spelled out. Know your funder. Know your funder. So I think, you know, for me, the biggest from budget, I start all of my grants by working out the budget, because once the budget is right, then you're going to have consistency through your narrative. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm figuring out a budget worksheet, but I really do start with the resources and what activities the resources are paying for. Because if those are not aligned between your project narrative, your program description, and your evaluation, like Nikki pointed out, the budget doesn't speak to it, and that happens all the time. I've edited thousands of grants, and it really does happen all the time. So that's a big piece of it. But knowing your funder and utilizing the grants process to build a relationship with your funder is key. Something that we all need to remember when we're working in the institutional space is that these funders have a mission. They have a philanthropic mission, and our organizations can help them achieve their philanthropic mission. That doesn't mean we want to go chasing after money that isn't really responding to our needs and our mission as organizations. But the sweet spot is when you're able to find that middle portion of the Venn diagram, and you're able to put into practice and out into the field work that's going to support the mission of a funder, which I think is actually why the National Trust is so good at bringing in regranting funds. We're able to do a lot of that work and make that case. There's also a fair amount of technical skill. But when I was working at organizations that did not have regranting programs, the key to winning those grants was absolutely to find the mission alignment and to build out that case for support. And that case for support needs to include a pretty robust theory of change. And as Nikki pointed out, looking at how the work is relevant, how our sites are able to operate as a lens for the most important issues of the day, that is how we're going to build the change and really articulate on a theory, build the case and articulate a theory of change that is compelling to a funder, as well as the evaluation. A thoughtful evaluation plan with real SMART goals is essential in order to win successful grants. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we often think of institutional giving as not really being relationship-based. And that is sometimes the case with government funding, because the panels and the folks that are really looking at our applications from one round to the next are different, but we can build relationships even with government funders, especially by having a track record and getting to know our program officers. But beyond that, if you're working with private foundations and corporations, seek out a meeting, present your idea, present your concept, let them know your organizational strategy before you're even writing, so that you're not spending a lot of time and resources on the preparation for grant applications that are laborious and highly technical at times for folks that are just not going to be interested in funding your project. So the relationship, lead with the relationship.
Right. And I think you both touched upon two questions that we had about building a compelling case and what you need to do to build a strong budget for your project. Is there anything else you want to add on to that? Or, you know, it sounds like those are two really essential parts of developing a grant, but anything else you want to add about that?
Be specific and clear in your language.
Okay.
No jargon.
All right. Next, we have a question about, should we include an evaluation plan? I'm guessing this is in a grant proposal.
If the funder requests an evaluation plan, then yes. And oftentimes what I have seen requested is a section on how you will evaluate, what your approach to evaluation will be, and then a separate section on what the metrics are that are going to inform your understanding of whether or not your project is successful in meeting goals. So really thinking through your approach to evaluation and what your metrics are going to look like is often a requirement. If it's not a requirement, you may not necessarily be doing yourself many favors by adding an attachment that wasn't requested, but it's always important to really work in how you will identify, or at least know that your work is successful, or identify the challenges that are coming up for your work so that you can iterate in a responsive way. What would you say, Nikki?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, for us, we try to scale our applications and what we ask for to the dollar size of the grant. So for our small dollar grant program, it's a very straightforward application. We don't ask for evaluation plans. At the back end, we don't ask for metrics, detailed metrics. We're more interested in, again, those community impacts, or how you interact with the community and those who might engage with the space. For some of our larger programs, we might ask for more detail along those lines. So I think it's, you look at the guidelines, answer what's being asked, but I agree that more is not always better.
Yes.
Sometimes you can invite more questions than it answers, right?
Exactly. You don't want to, you want to give enough information that you're answering the question and you're able to position yourself well with a response. But you don't want to get into a whole universe of information that the funder didn't ask for. Exactly, Nikki. Sometimes you're just opening up a lot of questions that don't need to be asked.
Right.
Economy of language is what I always share with grant writers. It's like, we need to be economical in our use of language. And with some applications, you don't have a choice because you've got 250 words and that's it.
Right.
Make it work.
Yeah. And I would say that it's nice when that word limitation is sort of put into the grant application itself, so you're not allowed to go over the number of words. So it's sort of a self-check that, no, that's all you have.
That's all you have. You've got to choose what you're including.
I think you addressed this in one of the earlier questions, but someone was wondering how to identify good funding prospects.
Great. I'll jump in on that one. So identifying good funding prospects, of course, you're going to look at their website if they have one. I always pull up the 990. So if you all have a free membership to Candid, you can pull up their 990. It's something I'm always looking at. I want to see what their finances are. I want to see what the activities are. I want to see how much a funder is, giving away in grant support. I just want to look at these financials. That gives me an idea of what they're really interested in versus what the website might tell you. Because the website might tell you that they don't have any open grant programs, and then you might see that they made 10 grants in the last fiscal year for one particular topic, and you know that this is a relationship-based entry that you need because they're not actually advertising their grant program. So look at the 990, look at their website if they have one. Get to understand what motivates their philanthropy, and then identify how you fit into what motivates their philanthropy. With a corporation, oftentimes we're not really talking about straight up philanthropy. We're really talking about a transaction that is really based on ROI, where a corporation would like to align their brand in specific ways to meet specific market objectives, and a nonprofit, a historic site, has the ability to help them do that. For example, at a historic site, we could look at having a corporation sponsor free days. So really removing barriers to admission, which advances our goal at a historic site, welcomes the public in different ways, aligns the brand of a corporation to our site, but that's not going to be a philanthropic ask. So those conversations are going to be about what matters to the corporation in terms of their branding objective. Like I mentioned, they're looking for really specific ROI that you can only learn through conversations with them, and then really tailoring and customizing sponsorship proposals for them. With foundations, we're talking about the mission alignment and the philanthropic impact, and really getting to the sweet spot there. And of course, finding prospects with government entities. If I can have a call with a program officer, I will have a call with a program officer, because I might have a project that I think is amazing. Even we have an application going out to the NEA. I think it's an amazing project. I would still like to talk to that NEA program officer at the National Endowment for the Arts to make sure that it's what they're thinking as well, right? And you learn a lot from the program officers too about fit. And oftentimes, if you were going in for a grant, for example, to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, let's say you had a major collections need, you wanted to digitize a collection at one of your sites, they might guide you from one of their grant programs to another one of their grant programs that's less competitive. So those, like, really, really getting to know your prospects, that work, the prospect management and relationship building work is a major component. Anything to add, Nikki?
No, you're far more expert on that than I am.
I mean, I feel like I could talk about this for hours.
People would probably love to hear it.
Right.
All right. We had a question about program related investment and about fundraising for impact investment. And I'm wondering if either of you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it in that it's not something the National Trust, it's not a mechanism of funding that we use, that we give. And Michelle, you and I were having a chat about this pre-call. So do you want to share what you know?
Yeah,
which is more than me again.
So we were, Nikki and I were talking about this question before the call, because there are some funders that are focused on impact investing. And, just to bring everyone up to speed, impact investing is when major foundations that have a fair amount of capital make investments in programs at really, really low interest rates. So they do need to be paid back. They are an investor into an initiative. It's not philanthropy. It's adjacent to philanthropy. But the reason it's philanthropic is because the interest rates are actually quite low, so you can borrow money at a low rate. Usually, impact investors in my universe come in when there are pretty large scale capital projects. I know in one of my previous jobs, we were looking at initiating an arts district in a neighborhood that really, had a complete lack of arts and culture and was flanked by multiple sports stadiums. So we were looking at impact investors to come in and build out the campaign plan for how we were going to make this arts district happen. But it's not my first line. It's not my first recourse with fundraising. And honestly, I haven't worked in enough organizations that have been involved with projects that really require impact investing. Here at the National Trust, I could see that potentially on the horizon if there were some major infrastructure need, but it's not something that I'm very familiar or experienced with. But I was curious about who asked the question and what project you've got cooking where you're thinking about impact investing, because that might be really interesting just to learn about and talk about, if you want to speak up.
Yeah, feel free, whoever submitted that question, to, supply some information in the chat about what you were thinking about. We'd love to learn more and maybe follow up with you separately.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting into like a little bit more specific questions. One is about writing grants for restoring a historic building and what are some best practices. This submitter had a few grant submissions that had failed in the past. So like anything specific about restoring a historic building that you all would recommend including in a grant submission.
Yeah. I mean, this might be an area where I know that we said avoid jargon, but this might be an area where jargon might be appropriate, where, demonstrating that you or the consultants that you're hiring, the firms that you're hiring, have a knowledge of historic preservation and will be able to undertake the project in a appropriate manner is very important to us as we're considering where we allocate our brick and mortar funding. And it's not to say that every organization needs to have a preservationist on staff, but you need to demonstrate that you either have partnerships with preservation organizations. You don't need to, but it's helpful to demonstrate that you have partnerships with preservation organizations, that your architect has experience in historic preservation, that your consultant, your roofer, your whatever tradesperson you're hiring, that they have the skills to work on a historic building. Those are things that we look for, and those are things that we're also happy to provide guidance on. So it's not that every application comes into us perfect. We might be very intrigued by the project, the site, the history, the current use, and we will work with grantees to help them find appropriate contractors in their area. So that's part of the relationship building, I think, that Michelle was talking about before. If you're uncertain about something and you're not sure that you're putting the best case forward, it's okay to reach out to us and share with us your project, share with us where you feel you might have gaps in your knowledge, and we can help you find resources in your community, partners, maybe your SHPO's office, people that can provide guidance to help you strengthen that proposal.
Right. Thanks. That's really good advice. Another question.
Rhonda, so we actually had for that impact investment question, we had Catherine spoke up in the chat, and she said basically to attract more funding to projects that they finance through our low interest historic property redevelopment fund, and a funder recommended that she explore that arena more. And hi everyone, this is Priya.
Great.
I would say, yeah, Catherine, we can connect offline. That would be, yeah. I would need to learn more, but I have some experience researching and looking at impact investors.
Great, thanks. This question was asking about recommendations for a small congregation with significant restoration needs, who have trouble getting larger grants. And, I think this would apply not just to a small congregation, but to smaller organizations who are applying to larger grants and may not have, a dedicated person that's working on a development or grant writing. Do you have any suggestions on how to approach that?
One thing we see in our giving, in our grant making, there will be organizations that come into us for larger requests, and it may be the first time that we've heard of this organization, that we've heard of the site. And so, sometimes those folks are successful, but sometimes they're not. And so we often encourage people then to come back to us for a smaller grant, maybe for a $2,500, $5,000 grant, a planning grant, something that can both help move the project forward because it is providing funding for some key early phases of a project, but it's also then establishing a relationship with us at a lower risk isn't quite the right term, but a lower point of entry for the applicant, let's say. And it's letting us get to know you, get to know your project, get to know your organization. So I think that's probably could be universally applied to any funder, like them getting to know you and know your work can maybe help leverage some of those bigger dollars down the road. But we've also found that we've heard from a lot of grantees over the years, a $5,000 grant isn't a huge amount of money, but it can be a really catalytic grant for some organizations because it comes from a national organization, the National Preservation Organization. It has some cachet. Our name has cachet attached to it to some extent, and can help people leverage those dollars and raise additional funds, and can really be a key turning point for some groups.
I would also add that demonstrating that you can manage the project for small organizations, a lot of times the difficulty is that there isn't a track record of managing major projects because, of course, you're a small organization, so these needs don't come up so often, right? Your programs are not going to be in the same league as a pretty significant restoration. So project management, fiscal management, anything that you can do to really substantiate that you have those technical skills across the organization is going to be important. And again, everything Nikki said about call your funders, ask the questions, get to know them. One other thing I thought of, if you've had a lot of grants denied through one organization, call them up and find out why. I often do that. If I get declined on a proposal that I thought was absolutely a shoo-in for this funding and it doesn't happen, I call and I find out why. There are many different reasons why that can be the case, but it's good for you to know them, and then you can tailor your future applications. Also, For very small organizations, I know this would be very difficult in some cases, but maybe hire a grant writing consultant that can help at least evaluate what your proposals are looking like. If they're responding to the grant opportunities in the best way possible, that it might be an investment that you need to make up front, but it would likely pay off down the line just by having some feedback.
Great advice from both of you. And we're going to transition a little bit into some more specific questions about the National Trust grants. If you joined late, I mentioned that we're going through some questions that were submitted beforehand, some general questions and some National Trust grant specific questions, but also invite you to submit questions through the Q&A because we'll hopefully have time to go through those as well.
Yeah, Rhonda, we have 3 really good questions in the Q&A. So
all right,
just so you know.
we'll make sure we get to them. Okay, so a general question about the trust grants. How does your funding work? Are we competing against projects from across the country, or are your funds more targeted? And I think I'm going to just ask Nikki to address
that. That's a good question. So both, either or, it depends on the program. So we have the kind of core program that the National Trust, the grants that the National Trust have been making since 1969 are through our National Trust Preservation Fund grant program. That program is a collection of different endowed funds, most of them state specific. So if you're applying to that grant program and you're from a state that has an endowed fund, say California, then we are only considering you against other applications that also came in from the state of California for our dedicated pool of money specific to California. And if you have applied to our Preservation Fund grant program recently, you'll have noticed that each grant round, we list the states where funds are available, because throughout the year, we will be spending down those state-specific buckets of money, and some of them have more resources available than others. So we try to be very transparent with applicants of where we do and don't have money for that grant program, because we don't want to waste your time applying for something that you're never going to get because there's just not the money there. So for some of our larger programs, so the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund related grant programs, for example, they are wildly popular. We receive a very large volume of applications for all of those programs. There you are competing against applicants from across the country. And so they're much more competitive. They are for bigger dollars. They're lengthier applications. But there, when you, and somebody had in the chat mentioned, you know, we received we were told we received high marks on our application, but we weren't funded. And in that case, it's when we go and look at a slate of eventual grantees, we're trying to balance resource type, geographic diversity, stories being told, just a whole host of different categories to present a slate of grantees that is representative of sites across the country. So for programs like that that are highly competitive, there are amazing projects that we would love to fund. We just don't, the resources aren't there to fund them all. So we have to make some really hard decisions. And so again, it depends on the fund that you're applying for. The preservation funds are certainly an easier point to entry for all of our grant programs.
Great. Another sort of specific question, can an inn or a B&B apply for grant funding if we were built in 1878 and on the National Register?
Okay.
So I guess asking, you know, both like age of resource and
Sure.
type of resource.
Sure. Okay, I'll tackle them in reverse order. So a site does not have to be on the National Register to receive funding from the National Trust. It does not have to be designated in any way. We consider sites 50 years or older as historic as a general rule of thumb. And as far as an inn or B&B, I'm assuming that is a for-profit business. And the vast majority of our grant programming grant funding goes to nonprofits or government agencies. So we do not fund for-profits for the most part, with the rare exception of some special partnerships, like our American Express partnership, where we just funded historic small restaurants. Those were for-profits, but that is by far the exception to the rule of our grant making.
Okay. Can an organization hold more than one National Trust grant at a time? And if you already have 2 grants, can you apply for a third?
Yes, yes. Our general rule of thumb is no more than 3 grants in a 2-year period, and you need to be current on any open grant. So if you have a final report that is overdue, or you have some sort of interim report that you haven't completed, make sure that those are done before you apply for anything new.
Great. And then are matching funds required for your program? We have limited resources and matching funds can be a challenge.
Yes, yes. So for the majority of our grant programs, we do either require matching funds or state that matching funds are preferred, that we like to see additional investment coming in. They're fund by fund. You should read the guidelines to determine if they're required. One thing we did, and in response to COVID, we'd always required in the past that a match be dollar for dollar cash match. When COVID hit and the economic uncertainty of that, and out of a desire to just help organizations sustain their staff, we loosened our matching requirements so that in-kind, staff time, things along those lines can now count as a match. And we hope that that makes it easier for organizations to meet those matching requirements.
Okay, so that was all of the pre-submitted questions we have. So now we're going to go to some questions that you all have submitted during the session. The first is, I'd love to know what sort of data points and stories you find most effective in sharing the impact of preservation with major donor prospects. I'm 1 year into my role, and generally our members, donors, love preservation, but I have struggled with coming up with completing proposals for unrestricted major gifts.
Unrestricted major gifts are hard. I don't know if you're all familiar with the donor pyramid. You're probably not, but it's a visual representation that the majority of our donors to organizations are making smaller annual gifts, and those tend to be unrestricted. So your annual fund campaigns are where oftentimes the majority of your unrestricted support comes to an organization. And then the more restricted, the higher level a gift becomes, the more restricted it becomes. We do include operating support and unrestricted support into every grant application that is submitted from my team. That's the case for the trust. That's the case for every organization in which I've worked. So if I've got a grant proposal going out, I'm making it up for $1 million, I'm going to try to include up to 30% in unrestricted support for the organization. Some organizations only request 10. My previous employer, we only did 10%. But somewhere between 10 and 30 is the most common. 15 to 20% is where the majority of it exists, that you bake in. So making the case and the data points and the narratives to tell your story, I'm going to go back to, it has to speak to the funder. So it depends on what the funder is interested in supporting. And it's hard to pinpoint it without knowing more specifics about what type of work you're doing exactly. But it's going to be data points and stories that are really mission centric and mission aligned about where you're going. I think what's very, very compelling is to understand organizational strategy and what your vision is for relevance. So if you're able to really articulate what your North Star initiatives are in an operating grant proposal and where you're going and how you plan to grow and deepen whatever programming you have to support that mission, that's likely going to get you more results than having data points about what you're doing now. right? But like I said earlier in the call, you do want to have some specificity and you want to be very, very clear about where you're going. So really thinking about your organizational strategy and working that in is quite important.
Great. Shifting gears a little bit to membership models. Someone asked, since so many of the next generation are not joiners, what recommendations can be made for organizations that depend on memberships as a way of supporting their mission? Are most of current organizations membership based, or are there new models out there?
That is not something that I have the background to speak on. Michelle, is that something you come across in your work?
It is. So at the Trust, of course, we're a membership-based organization. I was at the 4 Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh previously, and they were a membership-based organization. And the way that impacted really its annual fund and unrestricted fundraising is that it's a different way of bringing folks into your donor pipeline and your annual fund campaigns. So the way that membership is best leveraged is when oftentimes membership is used as a transactional approach to bring a visitor closer, increase repeat visitation, and it's like the initial point of engagement, right? Beyond like just a visit to your site. But shifting the mentality of membership from that transactional way of approaching it to the relationship building way of approaching it more quickly gets your members on a path to becoming your donors. So membership, again, I haven't worked in the annual fund space in quite some time, probably about 10 years, but the value of membership and the value of the annual fund is to really increase your base of support so that those who are giving on a regular basis, they might become your prospects for planned gifts, even if their annual giving is in the $30, $50, $100 a year range. It's to grow unrestricted support for your organizations. And membership, like I'm thinking about, membership-based organizations as opposed to higher education schools, universities that have alumni programs to really build their base for support. It's sort of akin to that, except that you do have like the memberships and the membership-based model. And it does become transactional because you get benefits for the price of membership, but ultimately, this is an opportunity to grow your support. Way beyond that, I don't have too much insight. It doesn't really impact or intersect with institutional giving or foundation grants very much at all.
Yeah. As someone who just graduated and just starting out professionally with development, what is your advice for building relationships with and understanding the background of those relationships with existing donors?
You have to get into first of all, I hope you have a database. I hope it's a good database and I hope it has data in it. That is not always the case. But if there's data in the database and you can look at the donor contacts and the meeting notes that have taken place from previous interactions with your donor, that's going to give you a lot of information based on how often they're giving, if there is an increase to their giving, if they self-identify. I've had donors come to me and say, you know what? I just saw your trains exhibition and I love trains and I really want to give to like the restoration of the trains hall. Okay, sure. Then you get to actually know them and build a relationship with them. But it is with individual giving and getting to know your donors, it's a one-on-one initiative, right? Like you really need to spend the time. And understanding institutional donors, that's going to be a little bit different because you do have greater insight into what institutional donors' priorities are because they're posted usually on websites, or like I mentioned, you can look at any foundation's 990. This is public information. You can do it through the free GuideStar. They were just bought by Candid membership and check it out. But that's how you get to know by looking at their 990 and their website a little bit more about them, their requirements, their passion, what motivates their philanthropy. But it's like a labor of love.
Yeah, I'm wondering, this is just me throwing in an additional question here. For those who might not have that database, do you have a suggestion of how to start? Either, are there platforms that people should look into, or where do you begin if you don't have that database?
Donor Perfect is a pretty inexpensive database that has pretty great capability that I've worked with in the past when you don't have the database. I worked at one organization where we really started from nothing. We had some paper donor files. We put as much information as we could into a spreadsheet. We figured out what fields of information we needed, like, of course, all the biographical information, name, address, etc., giving history. And then, of course, you want to track the relationship notes that tell you more about the contacts with a donor. So Donor Perfect really worked well for me. If you all would like more resources, I am very good friends with a brilliant donor researcher who deals with the technology side and the donor management side of things. And I could certainly ask her for recommendations, and I can send those off to Rhonda and Priya to share with the group.
Great. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
And as Priya mentioned, we're about to wrap up. So if you have any last questions, make sure to get those in the Q&A. We do have a question that is a little bit specific to National Park Service grants. So I'm not sure we'll be able to answer this. An advice might be to reach out to the Park Service for this, but they're wondering if you could talk about program income and how it should be reported if awarded a National Park Service grant. For example, if we received a Park Service grant to renovate a historic movie theater, and after renovations, we will have a renovated movie theater that charges entry fees. At what point do we report the income to the Park Service, and how is this reported, and are there restrictions to how that funding can be used? So I'm not sure that we can answer that, but I'll
that we can answer that question.
Yeah. I think
Park
you
Service
probably,
definitely.
yeah,
But
the
they're really
Park
great
Service-
to work with. I mean, they're wonderful.
Yeah, so they have very specific requirements. So I think it would be best to reach out to them with anything. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we're going to wrap things up. I wanted to share that we do have some resources about our grants. And here we go. For guidelines and links to applications, to sign up for our interest list, and for questions that you can reach out to us directly. And as Nikki mentioned, we're always happy to hear from you and happy to help as much as we can in the application process. And then I also wanted to plug that we have 2 more of these informal Q&As coming up next month. One focusing on preservation law, and another on preservation architecture. So if you are a forum member, you should have received information via email on how to sign up for both of those. And those will be a similar format to this one. And lastly, we'd like to thank all of you. We really appreciate our forum members. Thanks to Michelle and Nikki for sharing their insight and expertise. This was really helpful. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us, and be sure to check out the upcoming webinars on View that are coming up in the fall. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Thanks, Rhonda. Thanks, everyone.